The containment bay aboard the Zephyrian research vessel Dominion's Edge hummed with electromagnetic barriers as the ship's senior xenobiologist, Kethvar, observed his latest acquisition through reinforced transpari steel. The human female sat motionless in the center of the sterile chamber, her dark hair cascading over shoulders that remained steady despite the artificial gravity fluctuations designed to disorient prisoners. She had been unconscious when they'd retrieved her from the debris field of Earth's final defense station. And now, 3 cycles later, she had yet to display the panic responses that Kethvar's extensive files on human psychology predicted. Dr. Sarah Chen, according to the identification chip they'd extracted from her naval uniform, was supposed to be terrified. Every data point in the Galactic Consortium's research indicated that humans, when faced with superior alien intelligence and technology, would demonstrate the fear-based behaviors that had made their species such fascinating subjects for psychological manipulation studies. The Zephyrians had built their reputation across 17 star systems as masters of mental conditioning, capable of breaking any sentient being's will through carefully calibrated terror protocols. Yet this human remained an anomaly. Increase the subsonic frequency to level 7, Kethvar instructed his assistant, a younger Zephyrian whose cranial ridges still held the blue tinge of immaturity. And activate the environmental stress simulators. The chamber's atmospheric composition shifted subtly, introducing trace amounts of compounds known to trigger anxiety responses in most carbon-based life forms. The temperature dropped to just above the threshold of human comfort, while barely perceptible vibrations began emanating from the walls, a frequency calculated to resonate with the human nervous system and induce a state of unease. Sarah Chen opened her eyes. Kethvar leaned forward, his compound visual organs analyzing every micro-expression on her face. According to their behavioral prediction models, this was the moment when the psychological pressure would manifest as visible distress. The human should be experiencing elevated heart rate, dilated pupils, rapid breathing, and the involuntary trembling that preceded complete mental breakdown. Instead, Sarah stood up with fluid grace and walked to the observation window. "You know," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the audio pickups, "if you wanted to study human psychology, you probably should have captured someone who hadn't spent the last 15 years learning to destroy every weakness in herself." Kethvar's secondary heart skipped a beat. The human was looking directly at him through what should have been one-way transparasteel. More disturbing still, her biometric readings showed none of the expected stress responses. Her heart rate was steady, her breathing controlled, her pupil dilation consistent with someone who was merely curious rather than terrified. "Impossible," muttered his assistant. "The psychological profile indicates—" "The psychological profile," Sarah interrupted, somehow hearing their conversation despite the acoustic dampeners, "was based on civilian populations and standard military personnel. You never studied what humans become when they choose to forge themselves in the fires of absolute discipline." "Oh, okay." She pressed her palm against the barrier, and for a moment, Kethvar could have sworn he saw something predatory flicker across her features, a look that belonged on the face of a hunter, not prey. "I am Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen of the Terran Defense Force Special Operations Division. Before Earth fell, I was part of a program that very few people knew existed. We called ourselves the Iron Souls, humans who had undergone cognitive restructuring so complete that we no longer possessed the concept of surrender. We had systematically identified and eliminated every fear, every doubt, every weakness that could be exploited by an enemy." Kethvar felt his own stress responses beginning to activate. This was not how captivity scenarios were supposed to unfold. The human should be begging, pleading, offering information in exchange for mercy. Instead, she was delivering what sounded remarkably like a threat assessment. "The process," Sarah continued, her voice taking on an almost conversational tone, "involved extensive psychological conditioning, neural pathway modification, and something we called controlled ego death, the deliberate destruction of the vulnerable self. When you've already torn down every part of your identity that could be broken, there's nothing left for an enemy to target." She began walking around the perimeter of the chamber, her movements deliberate and measured. Kethvar noticed that she was mapping the space, identifying structural weak points, testing the effectiveness of the containment systems through subtle tactile examination. "The Iron Soul Protocol," Sarah explained, running her fingers along what appeared to be a decorative panel, but which Kethvar knew contained critical power conduits, was based on an ancient human philosophical concept, Only by destroying your weak self can you become truly indestructible. Every fear conquered becomes a weapon. Every limitation overcome becomes a source of power. The environmental controls registered a subtle shift in the chamber's atmosphere. Sarah had somehow triggered a feedback loop in the stress induction systems, causing them to work against each other rather than building cumulative psychological pressure. "Sir," the assistant whispered urgently, "her neural patterns are unlike anything in our database. Instead of fear responses, we're detecting what appears to be strategic assessment algorithms." Kethvar's scaled hands trembled slightly as he accessed the ship's central computer. The human's words were beginning to make terrible sense. If the Terrans had developed a method for creating individuals immune to psychological manipulation, individuals who literally could not experience defeat because they had already conquered every aspect of themselves that could be conquered, then the consortium's entire approach to human subjugation was fundamentally flawed. "You're wondering," Sarah said, turning back toward the observation window, with a smile that somehow managed to be both beautiful and terrifying, "how many more of us there are? How many iron souls escaped Earth's destruction? How many of us are already moving through your territories, learning your weaknesses, preparing responses?" She placed both hands on the barrier now, and her biometric reading showed something that made Kethvar's blood freeze in his veins. Her stress indicators weren't just normal, they were actually improving. The captivity scenario was making her calmer, more focused, more dangerous. "The beautiful thing about absolute self-discipline," Sarah continued, "is that it transforms every challenge into an opportunity. You think you've captured me, but what you've actually done is provide me with detailed intelligence about Zephyrian technology, psychology, and tactical capabilities. You've given me access to your ship's systems, introduced me to your command structure, and demonstrated your decision-making processes under stress." The chamber's containment field flickered briefly. So briefly that Kethvar almost missed it, but the human's smile widened just slightly, suggesting she had not only noticed but had somehow caused the fluctuation. "More importantly," Sarah said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you've made the classic mistake of assuming that humans are weak because we can feel fear. But fear was never our weakness, it was our raw material. Every terror we've ever experienced, we've learned to refine into strength. Every moment of doubt, we've transformed into unwavering certainty." Kethvar activated his emergency protocols, sealing the laboratory section and alerting ship security. But even as he took these precautions, he realized with growing horror that the human had likely anticipated these responses as well. "The Iron Soul Protocol," Sarah explained, settling back into a meditative posture in the center of the chamber, "doesn't just eliminate weakness. It converts weakness into tactical advantage. Every limitation becomes a source of innovation. Every obstacle becomes a pathway to victory." She closed her eyes, and for the first time since her capture, she looked almost peaceful. But Kethvar was experienced enough in predator psychology to recognize the expression. It was the calm of a hunter who had finished studying her prey and was now ready to act. "You see," Sarah said softly, "the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. But more than that, such a person becomes capable of things that those who still carry their weaknesses cannot even comprehend." The lights in the laboratory section flickered and died, plunging the area into emergency illumination. In the red glow of the backup systems, Sarah's smile was the last thing Kethvar saw before the chamber's containment field failed entirely. Part 2. The Awakening. The Dominion's Edge had been designed with the assumption that prisoners would remain exactly that, prisoners. The ship's security systems, like those of most consortium vessels, relied heavily on psychological deterrence rather than purely physical barriers. After all, when you could break a captive spirit within hours of containment, there was little need for excessive material defenses. Sarah Chen had completed her reconnaissance of the ship's fundamental weaknesses in the first 18 hours of her captivity, but she had taken an additional 67 hours to fully understand the psychological architecture of her captors. The Zephyrians she had discovered were a species that had achieved galactic dominance through their ability to inspire despair in their enemies. Their entire civilization was built around the concept of inevitable surrender, the belief that resistance to their superior intellect and technology was futile. This philosophy had served them well against species that maintained traditional concepts of self-preservation and defeat, but they had never encountered an opponent who had systematically eliminated those concepts from her consciousness. Moving through the ship's ventilation systems with the fluid grace that came from years of zero-gravity combat training, Sarah reflected on the irony of her situation. The Zephyrians believed they were studying human psychology, when in fact they were revealing the fundamental flaws in their own cognitive architecture. A species that derived power from inducing fear was, by definition, dependent on their victims' capacity for that fear. Remove that capacity, and their primary weapon became not merely ineffective but actively counterproductive. The Iron Soul Protocol had been developed during the final years of Earth's resistance, when it became clear that traditional military training was insufficient against enemies who waged war primarily through psychological manipulation. The program's architects had drawn from diverse sources: ancient Stoic philosophy, Buddhist concepts of ego dissolution, modern neuroscience, and cutting-edge cognitive restructuring techniques. The process had been voluntary but irreversible. Candidates underwent months of intensive psychological conditioning designed to identify and systematically eliminate every trace of the vulnerable self. Fear was not suppressed. It was transformed into analytical clarity. Anger was not controlled. It was refined into focused determination. Despair was not overcome. It was converted into unshakable resolve. Sarah had been among the first successful subjects, and the transformation had been more complete than even the program's creators had anticipated. She no longer experienced emotions in the traditional sense. Instead, she processed all psychological states as sources of tactical information. Terror became opportunity recognition. Pain became data for performance optimization. Even the concept of death had been restructured from a source of fear into simply another variable in the strategic equation. Emerging from the ventilation system into what appeared to be the ship's primary data processing center, Sarah began her real work. The Zephyrians' information networks were sophisticated but followed predictable patterns based on hierarchical authority structures. Like most civilizations that prioritize psychological dominance, they had neglected to consider what would happen when faced with an opponent who was immune to their primary means of control. The ship's computer systems proved remarkably vulnerable to infiltration by someone who approached them without fear of discovery or failure. Sarah's neural modifications allowed her to interface directly with the alien technology, her consciousness flowing through the data streams like water through carefully prepared channels. The Iron Soul Protocol had included extensive training in adaptive cognitive frameworks, enabling her to understand and manipulate any logical system regardless of its original design parameters. Within minutes, she had gained access to the ship's complete database, including detailed intelligence about consortium fleet movements, technological capabilities, and strategic objectives. But more valuable than any military intelligence was the psychological profile she was building of her captors and their civilization. The Zephyrians were apex predators, but they were also slaves to their own success. Millennia of easy victories had made them complacent, dependent on their ability to break their enemies' spirits rather than defeat them through direct confrontation. They had never developed contingency protocols for dealing with opponents who could not be psychologically manipulated because they had never encountered such opponents. More critically, their entire power structure was based on the assumption of inevitable victory. Individual Zephyrians derived their sense of identity from their species' reputation for invincibility. This meant that when faced with genuine resistance, not desperate struggle but calm, methodical opposition, their psychological framework began to destabilize. Sarah's analysis of the crew's behavioral patterns gleaned from internal surveillance data revealed stress indicators that were escalating far beyond normal parameters. The simple fact that a human prisoner had failed to exhibit expected fear responses was causing a cascade of anxiety throughout the ship's command structure. This was the fundamental weakness she had been looking for. The Iron Soul Protocol had taught her to view every system in terms of its failure modes. The Zephyrians' failure mode was the loss of psychological dominance, and that loss would create exponentially increasing instability throughout their operational effectiveness. Working with the methodical precision that came from absolute certainty of purpose, Sarah began implementing what she had designated as Phase 2 of her response strategy. The ship's life support systems, navigation controls, and communication networks were all connected through central processing nodes that could be accessed and modified by someone with the appropriate technical knowledge and the absence of limiting fears about potential consequences. She did not intend to destroy the vessel. That would be strategically wasteful. Instead, she was implementing what military theorists had termed constructive conquest, the conversion of enemy assets into friendly resources through systematic exploitation of systemic vulnerabilities. The first sign of her success came when the ship's environmental controls began fluctuating in patterns that seemed random but which were actually precisely calculated to induce maximum psychological stress in Zephyrian nervous systems. The temperature variations, atmospheric pressure changes, and lighting modifications were designed not to cause physical harm, but to create the kind of persistent, low-level anxiety that would gradually erode her captors' confidence in their own technological superiority. Next, she began introducing subtle modifications to the ship's internal communication systems. Messages between crew members started arriving with microscopic delays, just enough to create a sense that something was wrong, without being obvious enough to identify the source of the problem. Navigation readouts began displaying information that was technically accurate but formatted in ways that required additional cognitive processing to interpret. None of these changes individually would cripple the ship's operations, but their cumulative effect was to create the one thing that Zephyrians were psychologically incapable of handling: persistent uncertainty about their own competence. Sarah monitored the crew's stress responses through the ship's internal sensors, watching as confusion gradually gave way to anxiety, then to fear, and finally to something the Zephyrians had probably never experienced in their lives: doubt about their own inevitable victory. The truly elegant aspect of her strategy was that the harder they worked to identify and correct the malfunctions, the more they would destabilize their own psychological equilibrium. Every system check would reveal that their technology was functioning perfectly, which would force them to confront the possibility that the problem lay not with their equipment, but with their fundamental assumptions about reality. From her position in the ship's data core, Sarah felt something that might once have been satisfaction, but which she now experienced simply as confirmation of tactical effectiveness. The Zephyrians had captured her believing they would study human weakness, but instead they were about to discover what humans became when they systematically eliminated weakness from themselves. The Iron Soul Protocol had prepared her for exactly this type of scenario: outnumbered, outgunned, surrounded by enemies who possessed superior technology and expected easy victory. But those enemies had never faced an opponent who had already destroyed every part of herself that could be defeated. She was about to show them the difference between a human who feared monsters and a human who had become something that monsters feared in return. Part 3. The Iron Soul Unleashed. By the time Kethvar realized that his ship had been systematically compromised from within, the Dominion's edge was no longer truly under Zephyrian control. The human had not simply escaped, she had performed what could only be described as a hostile takeover of the vessel's entire operational framework. Standing in the ship's command center, surrounded by displays showing cascading system failures and increasingly panicked reports from his crew, Kethvar felt something he had never experienced in his 5 centuries of life: complete tactical helplessness. Every protocol they attempted to implement was anticipated and countered. Every security measure they activated was somehow turned against them. "Sir," reported his communications officer, her cranial ridges flushed with the deep purple that indicated extreme stress in their species, "the human has accessed our entire database. She has detailed intelligence about fleet positions, strategic objectives, technological specifications, everything." But even as the officer spoke, they both knew that data theft was the least of their concerns. The human was doing something far more dangerous. She was systematically dismantling their psychological superiority through a demonstration of absolute fearlessness. On the main display, security footage showed Sarah Chen moving through the ship's corridors with casual confidence. She was no longer hiding or attempting stealth. Instead, she walked openly, purposefully, as if she owned the vessel. When crew members encountered her, their reactions followed a predictable pattern: first confusion, then alarm, then a kind of paralyzed fascination as they tried to reconcile the sight of an unrestrained prisoner with their deeply held beliefs about Zephyrian invincibility. Analysis of her neural patterns, the science officer reported with a tremor in his voice, indicates that she is experiencing no fear, no anxiety. It's as if the concepts simply don't exist in her cognitive framework. Kethvar accessed the ship's internal sensors and confirmed the readings. The human's biometrics were not just stable, they were optimal. Her heart rate, breathing, and brain activity showed the patterns of someone engaged in routine, satisfying work. She was treating the conquest of their ship not as a desperate survival scenario, but as a professional exercise. "She's heading for the auxiliary bridge," reported security. "Should we seal the section?" "No," Kethvar replied, his scientific curiosity temporarily overriding his sense of self-preservation. He needed to understand what they were dealing with. even if that understanding came at a terrible cost. Sarah's voice echoed through the ship's communication system as she activated the general address function. When she spoke, her tone was conversational, almost friendly. "Crew of the Dominion's Edge," she began, "I want you to understand that what's happening here isn't personal. You're not being punished for your actions. You're experiencing a demonstration of advanced human psychological warfare." Kefvar watched his crew's stress indicators spike as the humans' words reached them. The idea that they were subject to human psychological manipulation, that the tables had been completely turned, was almost incomprehensible to Zephyrian minds.
"Your species has built its civilization around the ability to break other beings' spirits," Sarah continued.
This gave you tremendous advantages against enemies who possessed traditional concepts of defeat, surrender, and fear. But you never developed defenses against opponents who had systematically eliminated those concepts. On the security displays, Kefvar could see crew members standing frozen in corridors, their compound eyes fixed on speakers as they listened to what sounded like a lecture on their own obsolescence. The Iron Soul Protocol represents the next stage of human evolution. Not biological, but psychological. We identified the fundamental weakness in our species' survival architecture: the capacity for despair. Then we engineered individuals who could not experience that weakness no matter what pressures were applied. Sarah had reached the auxiliary bridge now, and to Kefvar's amazement, she began systematically activating control systems with the casual expertise of someone who had studied Zephyrian technology for years rather than hours. The process, she explained as she worked, required us to confront and destroy every aspect of our personalities that could be broken. We underwent controlled psychological death and rebuilding, emerging as something that retained human intelligence and creativity but possessed none of the vulnerabilities that your species has learned to exploit. Kefvar realized with growing horror that the human was not just taking control of ship systems. She was broadcasting her activities to the entire crew, making sure they could see exactly how easily their supposedly superior technology was being mastered by someone they had expected to reduce to gibbering terror within hours of capture. "The beautiful paradox," Sarah continued, her voice maintaining that same calm instructional tone, "is that by destroying our weak selves, we became stronger than we ever imagined possible. Fear, doubt, despair, these weren't sources of weakness to be overcome. They were raw materials to be transformed into unshakable resolve." The ship's navigation systems came under Sarah's control, and she began altering course without any apparent concern for the crew's consent or survival. At her new heading, Kefvar noted with confusion, was not toward Earth or any known human stronghold. "I'm taking you to Consortium Central Command," Sarah announced, as if reading his thoughts. "Not to surrender or negotiate, but to demonstrate something that will fundamentally change the balance of power in this galaxy." She paused in her work and looked directly into the nearest security camera, her dark eyes seeming to stare straight through the display at Kefvar himself. "You wanted to study human psychology," she said, and for the first time her smile carried an edge that made Kefvar's primary heart skip several beats. "Now you're going to help me teach the entire consortium about what humans become when they choose to transcend the limitations of the fearful self." The ship's weapon systems came online under Sarah's control, and Kefvar watched the targeting displays with fascination and terror as she demonstrated mastery of Zephyrian military technology that exceeded most of his crew's capabilities. "The Iron Soul Protocol," Sarah explained, apparently enjoying the pedagogical aspect of her demonstration, "doesn't just eliminate weakness, it converts weakness into strategic advantage. Every fear conquered becomes a weapon. Every limitation transcended becomes a source of power. Every moment of doubt transformed into unbreakable certainty." She had gained complete control of the vessel now, and the crew's stress indicators showed psychological states that Kefvar had never seen in his species. They were experiencing something beyond fear, beyond despair. They were confronting the complete collapse of their fundamental worldview. "The man who destroys his weak self," Sarah said, her voice taking on an almost philosophical quality, "can never be destroyed by others. But more than that, such a person becomes capable of things that those who still carry their weaknesses cannot even comprehend." Kefvar watched in fascination as his crew began exhibiting behaviors he had only observed in the species they had conquered. Desperate attempts at negotiation, offers of cooperation, pleas for mercy. The psychological roles had been completely reversed, and his people were discovering what it felt like to be on the receiving end of absolute psychological dominance. You see, Sarah concluded, settling into the captain's chair with the satisfaction of someone who had completed a successful exercise, you made a fundamental error in your assessment of human nature. You assumed that our capacity for fear made us weak, but you never considered what we might become if we learned to forge that fear into something stronger than weakness, more enduring than strength, into the absolute certainty that comes from having already conquered every part of ourselves that could ever be conquered. The ship's communication systems activated, broadcasting on all consortium frequencies, and Kethvar realized that Sarah's demonstration was not intended solely for his crew. She was about to announce to the entire galactic civilization that the age of easy conquest was over, that humanity had produced individuals who could not be broken, could not be intimidated, and could not be defeated because they had already destroyed every part of themselves that defeat could touch. As the Dominion's edge continued toward consortium space under Sarah's absolute control, Kethvar found himself experiencing something he had never thought possible: genuine respect for a member of what he had considered an inferior species. The human had not simply escaped captivity, she had transformed it into victory, through the application of psychological evolution that his people had never imagined possible. The Iron Soul Protocol, he realized, represented more than advanced military training. It was a fundamental transformation of what it meant to be sentient, a conversion of consciousness itself into an unbreakable weapon, and Sarah Chen was about to demonstrate to an entire galaxy exactly how effective that weapon could be. In the quiet of the ship's bridge, as alarms fell silent and systems stabilized under their new commander's expert control, Kethvar finally understood the true meaning of the ancient human wisdom that Sarah had shared. The individual who destroys his weak self becomes truly indestructible, not because he cannot be harmed, but because harm itself becomes simply another tool for achieving victory. The consortium was about to learn that lesson in ways they would never forget. Epilogue. The new paradig. 6 months later, the Psychological Warfare Manual distributed to all consortium forces contained a new classification system for human encounters. The entry for Iron Soul operatives was brief but unprecedented in its acknowledgement of tactical parity. Subjects who have undergone advanced psychological conditioning that eliminates traditional fear and defeat responses. Standard intimidation protocols are ineffective and may prove counterproductive. Recommend immediate strategic withdrawal and consultation with High Command before engagement. It was the first time in consortium history that they had officially acknowledged the existence of enemies who could not be broken through psychological manipulation. Sarah Chen's demonstration had lasted only 72 hours, but it had fundamentally altered the balance of power in the galaxy. The message she had broadcast from the captured Zephyrian vessel had been simple. Humanity had evolved beyond the reach of fear, and the age of easy conquest was over. The Iron Soul Protocol had proven that the destruction of weakness was not just a philosophical concept. It was a practical transformation that could reshape the very nature of conflict itself. And in facilities hidden throughout human space, more candidates were undergoing the process that would forge them into beings that even monsters learn to fear.